Hello again. In this video, I'm going to review some analytic models and methods that are used by strategic planners to understand the evidence and data that they collect regarding industries and markets. Your teams recently have been gathering information about the external environment, the economy, markets, and industry structure. And so the question at this point is, what do you do with that information? How do you understand what it means for your company's strategy? What are the implications of this information? And I think that you will find that these models that I'm about to demonstrate for you to be very helpful. And I hope that you will use them. I hope that you will print out the PowerPoints for this video and then apply these models in your cases that you're currently working on to study the company that you and your teammates chose. So with that, I'm going to get going, but let me make a quick remark. You may think that I look a little thinner in the face, or at least I've been told that some people have that impression. You may recall that I was out of class for a week with a combination of the flu and pneumonia. That was no fun. But then I came back to class and I hope that I was effective, but it appeared that I had recovered. Since you've been on spring break, I recontracted the flu. At least we think that's what it is, but I've got it again, and so I may cough or stop to bathe my throat or just take a quick break. But I hope you'll forgive me if I have to interrupt this video for that purpose. It's just that I've got that damn flu again, and it's been a rough winter. I can't wait for it all to be over. So with that, let me get started and talk about things that are a little more positive here. And there it is. And here it is. These are analytic models that we can use to assess the international business environment, and for that matter, the domestic environment, if we know what we're doing. But these models initially were developed for international business analysis. And these are the models that we'll be going over. The first is the BCG Matrix. That's not an international model. It certainly can be, and I think in my comments I'm going to explain how it can be used for international strategy analysis. But this model can be used to analyze the industries and or products where companies that do business only domestically operate. So anyway, the model was developed to interpret and understand how firms' strategies should change as the industry life cycle changes. So you can see that there are two dimensions on this, this framework, the growth rate, the industry's growth rate, and the firm's market share. A firm that has a high share of a growth market, where would growth markets be on the life cycle? They're probably in the growth stage, right? So the star is going to be found in a section or segment of the life cycle where the industry is growing pretty rapidly. And the company has fortunately accomplished a large market share. Now, as the life cycle and the industry mature, the growth rate will slow down. And so we'll move down from high growth to not so high to low. And when we get down here, these are the same companies that still are probably even larger, but at this point, there's not as much need for marketing expenditures, not as much need to develop new capacity because the industry's growth has leveled out. And so the profit that a company makes at this level becomes free cash flow available to invest in other enterprises. And one way to invest that cash flow, of course, is up here in the stars, because they're growing faster than these companies, but as they grow faster, they need to invest in working capital. They need to invest perhaps in new capacity and product development. And so although they're making a lot of profit, they may not be generating a lot of cash. And it may be that these cash cows have to provide a little bit to the stars. Now, the stars are making a lot of profit and they're very creditworthy. So they may not need a whole lot of help from down here. The rest of the cash goes here to ventures, which are new businesses. Where would we find new ventures on the life cycle? Where do you think? In the early stages, right? In the embryonic stage and early growth stages. So these industries are just, and products are just developing, and this new cash is available to provide for the startup of these businesses, because they're not going to be profitable right away, and they're going to need transfusions here. Some of these ventures won't make it. They'll start up, they'll have a lot of promise, but they just won't grow very fast, or they will not necessarily achieve the differentiation and the features that the market appreciates in other rivals' products. And so as much as they would like to go here and become stars, they may dwindle down into the level of dogs. And at this point, they'll probably be ejected or perhaps reinvented somehow to try it again. But normally they're liquidated or sold. Once in a while, less than 50% usually, ventures are successful. They grow faster, they gain high market share, and they become stars. And so this process it essentially repeats itself. It's meant to be a virtuous circle, if you will. So the ventures become stars, the stars eventually become cash cows, and they provide cash for the new ventures. And so you have a cash pump. That's how it's supposed to work. We can use this device either to assess our current products, or we can use it to assess the entire industry. And so that's why it's usually, the BCG matrix is usually discussed as an industry analysis tool, because you can put not just your own products into this format, but you can put the products of competitors as well. Now, the problem when you do that is that these diagrams become very crowded with all these different pictures of products. We usually use a circle, a small circle, might be over here, but these are these little product lines that are being developed, so you might have a half a dozen of them here. Stars, of course, become, as the circle moves its way to the left, it becomes larger. Of course, an industry leader would have a great big circle. And then as it moves down, the circle size probably does not get smaller, but the significance of the product is, it changes greatly, because the product is no longer growing very fast. So that's how products could be placed on this matrix, either products of just your own products, and we would use that in the capabilities analysis when we would, when we analyze our product mix and our portfolio of products. You can use this BCG matrix to just look at your company's product lines and discover whether you've got a balanced portfolio of products or one that's lopsided. As a consultant, very often I would visit companies and find lots of cash cows and not enough attention to the requirements to develop, cultivate, and with new cash and grow new businesses. Very often when I found stars, these stars had been acquired from other companies. So this is a really important, useful framework, because it can be used in industry analysis and it can be used in capabilities analysis. I don't think I've missed anything in the description here, but I hope you'll take time to read it, just because I don't want you to miss anything or any opportunity to use these tools in your project. Here's another tool or model that was developed by Michael Porter, the famous strategy professor at Harvard. And Porter had been asked by a government to figure out how countries can develop industries that will become winners in international competition. And so Porter set out to try to find out. He said when he was asked to do this that he really didn't have an answer, but he would do research in order to develop an answer, and the result was the national diamond. So long story short, some companies are located in industries that cultivate them more than other countries cultivate companies in the same industry. And there are four driving forces that influence the extent to which a country supports an industry according to Porter's model. The first is factor conditions. For those of you who've had courses in microeconomics, factors of production should not be an unfamiliar term. But factor conditions that affect an industry's performance differ greatly between countries. So the firm that wants to build a particular product and develop and then grow internationally wants to find a home base to start out. The whole reason that Porter did this diamond was to show companies how to find countries to start new businesses, because once they get going, once they flourish, then those companies can expand into other countries. And when they do, they might look for similar diamond conditions, but the way they grow initially is strongly influenced by these four driving forces. The second of the forces is called demand conditions, and it pretty well expresses itself. But it's not what demand conditions mean that matters here. What matters is the understanding of this model's significance. In Porter's opinion, in order to start an industry successfully, a company has to have favorable conditions, factor conditions, and demand conditions, so that that industry can get started on the right basis, to grow strong roots, to develop capabilities, as including methods and procedures. If there's not a lot of demand for the product or the benefits that customers can expect from that product, then you're rolling upstream. You're probably not going to succeed. So favorable demand conditions are obviously necessary. The third item, and this is one that has become, this item has spawned a whole different category of strategy study related and supporting industries. So sometimes we refer to companies that are related and support each other as clusters. So there are clusters of companies that perhaps make parts for the company that assembles them. Maybe there's another company that distributes to the retailers or the industrial customers, for that matter. Maybe there's another company that provides maintenance services and so forth, and so forth. So in a particular industry, there usually are a few very vital industries that are related to your company and its products or services, and support your company and your rivals. So the what's a classic illustration? The software and hardware, right? The game console and the game software. You can't really have much of a video game if you don't have a good console to give you a good play, but you can't have a good game if you don't have good software to run on that thing. So you get the idea, I think. And finally, Porter put strategy, structure, and rivalry. Frankly, the most important term here to me is rivalry, but Porter included the strategy of companies in your industry, the industry's structure, both of which are going to affect the amount of rivalry that exists. Rivalry, as we will see in another video, another exhibit here pretty quickly, has a great deal to say about the performance potential of companies in an industry. And in this particular case, we're not looking for low rivalry. In the 5 forces, low rivalry is preferred for the profitability of companies. But when we're looking at whole industries, it's usually moderate industry rivalry that's the best. When we get to very high rivalry, companies do stupid things, including compromising quality, choosing low cost instead of high quality, and so forth. So we really need to look at an industry in the particular country. Remember, this is all about one country. Does this country have a high loading on these variables, these drivers? And if the score is high, it indicates that the industry's growth potential in that country is high, and it indicates that if you are one of the companies in this industry, in that country, you're on favorable turf, you're on good ground. Chances are favorable, conditions are favorable. Going to get a cough drop here just to be on the safe side. This is a scorecard that can be used for Porter's diamond. And most of the exhibits that I'm going to show you in this video were prepared by student teams who used these techniques. In this particular case, and I don't recall the case that it was used for, although I have a suspicion that because Mexico is here, but you'll see Mexico in another exhibit where it's pretty obvious what company is being analyzed. But in any event, you can see that in this analysis, the United States, with the green number, has almost a perfect average, almost a perfect 5. 5 is the highest grade, 1 is the lowest grade, 5 is an A, 1 is an F. You can see that the lowest grade, the weakest score in this analysis turned out to be Brazil. And Mexico was pretty close to that, whereas China was pretty close to the US. So not only can you get a sort of a bottom line, but you can also go into this scorecard and identify exceptions. So why is Brazil's score so low? And the answer is that rivalry is unacceptable here. And so it has a low score. And here in Spain, demand isn't very strong, and so forth. In India, factor conditions aren't favorable. So wherever you see these kinds of loadings that are unfavorable, you can ask whether your company's strategy could offset these shortcomings. If you can figure out how to do that, you probably can go into that country on a favorable basis, because other companies that went into that particular country probably have had a rough time of it and may not, none may even be there. So if you can figure out how to solve these problems, you could seize competitive advantage. Okay, now rivalry, which we just talked about up here, and we've recorded a grade for it here, right? But that grade was done differently than the way we graded rivalry in a 5 forces analysis, which some of you have done with me already. So it's important to discuss this. So when we're looking at the impact of rivalry on an industry, to see what the impact of rivalry and those other factors may have on an industry's growth potential. We don't want the company to have low rivalry, because in that case, there's no incentive to raise the standards, to raise the bar, to raise the quality. A little bit of competition is not a bad thing here. So we want some rivalry. But after we reach a certain point, rivalry gets to be damaging as we move back down along this scale. As rivalry gets higher, what will happen is that companies will start to make exceptions to the rules, I guess you would say. They may compromise quality. They may compromise customer service. They may find other ways to get their costs down, and also to respond to sometimes chaotic moves by their rivals. You know, when we're down here, this is like a bunch of dogs in the street fighting over a scrap of meat. You know, you see it in the movies sometimes. I'm a scuba diver, so I like to watch movies of scuba diving in various parts of the world, and I have dove with sharks, and sometimes the filmmakers will throw a box of fish meat into an area where there is a school of shark, and those shark will go into what's called a feeding frenzy, and they'll not only try to eat the fish meat, they'll try to eat each other, you know, bite each other. It just becomes a chaotic chaos. But it's worse than chaos. It's a frenzy. In a situation like that, an industry cannot grow in a healthy way. It can't take time, or its participants can't take time to plan reasonably, to make reasonable investments, and so forth. So the bottom line is that what we want when we're looking for an industry's growth and health is moderate rivalry, not low rivalry, as is the case in Porter's 5 forces. But in Porter's 5 forces, we're talking about the profit potential, not the growth potential, not the potential for integrity and health, but rather pure profit. So profit potential is highest for a firm when rivalry is low. And when rivalry gets higher, research has shown that Porter had it right, profit potential will decline. So this is the way we look at rivalry in the 5 forces, but this is the way we look at it when we're analyzing industries. So with that, I'll move on to Porter's 5 forces. Now, you're aware, right, that in this case, we're talking about the analysis of industries, right? Okay. And here we are analyzing the way in which countries can enhance the growth and health of industries so that once they are started, they can go off into the world strong, vibrant, with methods and procedures that give them competitive advantage. You know, the national diamond is a device that lets us know how well equipped a country is to support the growth of an industry. Okay, so here we are now with Porter's five forces. I think you've probably heard of it before. Um, I just assume that because it's a very popular industry analysis model. So each of your firms should do an analysis of Porter's five forces to assess the industry's profit potential. And what I'm going to show you now are three different ways of reporting the five forces, the results of a five forces analysis. So here's a fairly simple one, but it serves a purpose. It simply provides an overview of those five forces and their relative strength. And so rivalry is pretty high in the industry that was analyzed here. The threat of new entrants is low. The threat of substitutes is moderate. Suppliers' power is low, but buyers' power is high. So you see a pretty common pattern here where the buyer has the opportunity to shop at another number of locations, whether that buyer is a consumer or an industrial purchasing agent. Very often, the suppliers of industrial production goods, such as rivets and connectors and sheet metal, just a variety of commodities, very often the buyer has a lot of power in selecting where they want to buy those commodities. Obviously, if you're talking about groceries, you've got the same situation where Mrs. Smith can go to a lot of different stores. In either case, what happens is that there is likely to be pretty high rivalry. And in a case like that, firms that want to do business in this kind of environment have to offer both low cost and or adopt both low cost and differentiation strategies. Just one probably won't be enough. If in fact there is a threat of substitutes, that is to say that what that purchasing agent or Mrs. Smith can gain by buying another company's product, a different product, if that product will offer the same benefits as products in your industry can, then that presents another problem altogether. I won't get into those problems too much right now because we just don't have time for it. But for your information, when the threat of substitutes is high, the substitute product can put a limit on your industry's pricing. So let's say that you are selling Coca-Cola. Well, there are other beverages, aren't there? Coffee, tea, bottled water could be a different industry. And to the extent that there are substitutes for your product, if they are equally satisfying and their prices are lower than yours, in order to keep your market share, you're going to have to drop your price to theirs. The profit, remember, Porter's 5 forces is intended to reveal the, trying to move my chair up, to reveal the profit potential of an industry, not your company, but the industry and all of its participants. In this particular case, the industry's profit potential is moderately low. And the strategy of companies in that industry are going to have to emphasize both low cost and differentiation as well as pricing. To get the differentiation that you need, you're probably going to need a lot of attention to customers, customer service, customer relations management, and so forth. I wish this team had put in low cost. Maybe I can do it right now. Both cost there we go, and pricing. Okay, because pricing ultimately is going to be what gets attention, but whether the product is worth the price, whether it's valuable to the customer, is the other half of the equation. Okay, here's another way of doing Porter's 5 forces. And it's, I like it a lot. It's graphic. It tells you where the problems are and where they are not. And sort of things sort of stand out. As you can see down at the bottom, this was an analysis of the cement industry. And the company under analysis was a company in Mexico called Cmax. I urge you to look at it. It's a fascinating case, a very well-managed company that got caught when the construction industry turned down in 2008 and 9. But it's on the mend and growing again. But the Cmax makes cement and concrete and provides contractors with those products. There are some substitutes in that industry, particularly steel and lumber, because structural elements can be made of those products as well as concrete. Here's a full-blown quantitative analysis, as in the same way that we looked at it previously, but now high rivalry, and I hope this team did it right. This would have been moderately low rivalry. This would be a high rivalry in Mexico for concrete and so forth. And so it's an inverted scale here. The other forces are pretty much self-evident. So the substitutes are not much of a problem in Mexico or anywhere else for that matter. I'm looking to find an easy one. The threat of new entrants is good. So the threats of new entrants were highest in India and Brazil and China. So they would have added to the pressure on profit potential. Supplier potential, that is the ability to supply. I don't know whether this was Cmax or not, but it looks like suppliers have a pretty strong force in Mexico and China here, and so forth. So we can total up all these scores, which are on a 1 to 5 basis, and then divide them by 5 and get their score on that same scale, 1 to 5. And you can draw a couple conclusions. First of all, it's a pretty tightly knit bunch of scores. It looks like there's one company that sort of stands out, right? And that's China. This is the profit potential of this industry and the firms in it. And what you and I need to remember, oh, and the US, sorry about that. What you and I need to remember is that we have now been confronted with the coronavirus pandemic and its impacts on the economies of China and the US will be pervasive. I really don't know which company is going to be impacted and damaged the most. I know that both countries will be damaged greatly. And so when this analysis is done in the future, we'll probably see big changes. I can't honestly tell you what those changes are going to be yet. I don't think anybody really knows how this pandemic, this crisis will end up. But after the crisis is over, we're still going to need to develop new businesses in probably new and existing industries. And in order to understand where geographically the best profit potentials exist, using a technique like this can be very helpful. Cage analysis was developed by a guy named Pankaj Ghemawat, who, like Porter, is at the Harvard Business School. And Professor Ghemawat has spent a lot of time looking at international market conditions and international strategy, and probably one of the, if not the leading thinker in international strategy, one of a few. So in his writings, and he has published many writings, he coined this term CAGE, which is an acronym for cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic. And in each of those cases, he's referring to the distance between countries. So if we're in the United States and we want to sell our products in Italy or China or Russia or India, what kind of distances are we going to deal with here? And how significant will they be in putting up barriers to our entry into that country's industry that deals in our products? And so Ghemawat really did us a favor by identifying these main factors. There are others. Ghemawat has talked about them, but these are the 4 basic ones. And so I urge you, especially if you're in my international business course, to do a CAGE analysis. I think you'll find it very informative. Incidentally, one of the problems we have when we do an analysis like this is we run into the problem of students not being experts in countries, cultures, administrative interior administration. The geography is a little easier to understand, and we usually have pretty good information about economic differences, but sometimes the technical isn't as valuable as the behavioral impacts of those differences. And so what I tell my students, and this goes for you too, do not be concerned if you're not an expert, and you're not an expert. So simply look at the material you gather about your company and the country that you're looking at. Use your best guess. Maybe talk about this among your team members, and make some judgments using the scorecard that I'll show you in just a minute. If I disagree with you and your ratings, because I think I know something you don't, that will not affect your grade at all. Zero impact, okay? What I want you to do is go through the exercise, and when you get there, say something that explains what was on your mind when you gave the factor that you're talking about, the rating that you did. So cultural pretty much stands for its own. I've put some ideas about the kind of concern. I think this was a case where the team was looking at, it was a producer of elevators in Europe that was planning to form a subsidiary in India. And so this analysis kind of suggests the kind of barriers to entry that this team, that this company needed to consider. So the paperwork and administrative barriers in India for foreign countries is really substantial. Some countries have demanding standards. Probably this was not the greatest issue in India. Government regulation was a huge issue, and building codes. Geographic differences or distances are really important. In this case, a more sophisticated elevator was imported rather than built in India, and that was a bit of a problem because of the transportation difficulties and problems getting products into the country. Another problem in India is the roadways. The roadways are just terrible. So you couldn't build an elevator box in one city and transport it on a truck to another city. By the time it got there, it would just be sheet metal, scrap. The roadways are just not very smooth. So Schindler, the company that was analyzed here, had to figure out how to assemble these products by shipping kits to locations throughout the country, and then assembling and installing them locally. And finally, economic differences. Where I think I won't get into these points, but rather remind you that consumer products respond quite a lot to economic distances as well as cultural. So in India, by way of example, the ability of people to afford, the majority of people, to afford really comfortable apartments, let alone homes, but apartments and living conditions is somewhat limited. So that will impact the kind of apartment buildings that are constructed. And there's a lot of construction going on in India. But the kind of construction will differ simply because of the economic infrastructure of India. So I think that's enough for this model. Those of you in the international business course really ought to do this analysis. Here's how you would score several countries. I really don't know what the point of that NAFTA note is under administrative. I don't, I'm sorry. So in any event, you can see that it looks like this may actually be the Cmax analysis. And the reason I think so, and that explains the NAFTA notice. But you can see here, Mexico, the company that was analyzed was Cmax, a Mexican company, and that company obviously had no cultural barriers in its own country, and nor did it have any difficulty meeting administrative requirements. It was comfortable with them. And administrative barriers were small, but NAFTA was relevant in that case because NAFTA had the effect of reducing administrative barriers. And in other parts of the world, there are other trade agreements that could make a difference. So it looked like India had the highest barriers to entry. Okay, so this means that it's going to be tough to take a building product in industry, a building product firm into India. Looks like there are cultural, administrative, and geographic barriers. Economic barriers apparently not quite as high. I would think that they also would be pretty high. And so the barriers to entry in India in the construction industry or building components industry pretty high. On the other hand, you have a fairly similar case with China. And the difference is simply the difference between 5s down here and 4s here for cultural and administrative. Obviously, the easiest country for Cmax to enter is its own country, but it wasn't a perfect one. So now we're going to look at a way in which cultural differences in the model we just looked at can be better identified and understood. And in the international textbook, there's, I believe, a chapter with Hofstede's model of countries' cultures. But for those of you who might have had international business with me or are having it now, if you've already had it, then you know how to do this analysis. And it's a great way to come up with a justifiable answer to the cultural barriers when you're doing the scorecard. So this is one of those cases where I hope I'll be able to go along pretty fast. There are 4 basic drivers of differences between countries, cultures, according to Hofstede. Later on, after putting together the basic model, he added another one, which is long-term orientation. I think he really has something there. But the first one is power distance. How difficult is it for people to get eyeball to eyeball? Do people take each other simply as people, or do they have to respect the rank, the title, the social status, and so forth? And the differences on this slide are very believable. Latin countries tend to have high power distance. Peru, as you can see, is very high. On the other hand, Northern Europeans generally have low power distance. And that's especially true in Scandinavia. And I think we don't see any Scandinavian countries here. And that's unfortunate. But what I've learned about the Scandinavian countries, and that there are variations between those four countries. But generally speaking, a subordinate of a manager can meet that manager's boss in the hallway or a restaurant or whatever, and start a conversation. And if asked questions, answer them, and no tension, because the power distance in those countries is really low. Everybody's the same. When we get to uncertainty avoidance, another way of saying that is risk avoidance. And in some countries, we can see that risk avoidance is pretty high. And Portugal is amazing. But China, what is often surprising to people is that risk avoidance in China is quite low. And yet it's true. The Chinese are innovators and entrepreneurs. They also have high power distance. You've got to respect the status of the person you're talking to. But if we were to look right down here, see if I can copy this and paste it. What the hell did that do? I didn't want that. That's what I got from a. See if I can get it this time. Yeah, good. Okay, so here we have Japan, another leading Asian country with a risk avoidance or uncertainty avoidance score that is very, very high, whereas in China's case, they'll try something. In Japan's case, they want to have the rationale for moving into a new venture, a new product, a new market, really well laid out. So the difference between those two countries is quite stark. Individualism versus collectivism, again, is a big item. The US has always prided itself as being ruggedly individualistic. I really think that if this analysis were done again today, the US would not have a score of 91. It would be lower. I see a lot less willingness to step out and be innovative without some kind of a crutch. Venezuela, on the other hand, like other Latin American and Latin European countries, they would prefer that not to go out on their own, but to do things together. And if we get to China here, we see a fairly similar, see if I can get that. Yeah. So in China, there's also a very low level of individualism. Whoa, there we are. And finally, masculinity, before we get into the new dimension. This is a very misleading dimension. This is not about gender or sex at all. Hofstede used masculinity and femininity as metaphors for the behavior of economies and masses of people. If masculinity is really strong, then there's a tendency to gain, to acquire things, and to acquire companies, and to dominate, to set the rules. On the other hand, if masculinity's score is very low here in Chile, then femininity score would be rather high. Femininity is all about maintaining the family structure, keeping the organization together and intact, trying to see that people don't feel the need to go away or get outside of the family, but to keep the organization intact, as opposed to being more aggressive, more exploratory, and acquisitive in the case of masculinity. One of the things I've done in my travels, I don't see it here now, is go to Russia. Russia's score on masculinity is really low. It's something like, I don't know, 30 something. If I kind of thought about what would happen if I walked up to a Russian guy and said, I understand that your culture, your industry, and your culture and your industry is very feminine. And I figure the guy would probably knock me down. So I never said anything like that. But Russia has a communist government and a socialist and communist history, as you know, and the emphasis is on keeping the group together. And so no surprise that Russia has high scores on femininity and low scores on masculinity. It has nothing to do with the the hormones of the people in Russia. Anyway, this takes us to the last item that was added some time ago, and that is the long-term orientation. And you can see, and I can attest to this, the Chinese don't think in terms of tomorrow. They think about what the objectives are and the potential in the long term is. And so you can see that China's rating on long-term orientation is pretty high. Japan's, of course, is also. The Japanese have always taken a long-term view of industry. Then you can see the United States way down here. Um, and this is not a favorable comment on American business. And it frankly concerns me a great deal about how the United States will come out of this coronavirus issue. And I hope my concerns are misplaced. The way that China will look at this problem is to reestablish the Chinese economic empire and to develop it into something stronger, perhaps by helping some countries overcome the problems that they encountered that the Chinese are able to help them solve. I think the US industry, US politics, and so forth is probably going to be very self-centered and very short-term. They're not going to be willing to wait for a better outcome, a much better outcome, if they can capture a better outcome today rather than a much better outcome in the future. Now, you know, it seems that our government's doing a really good job dealing with this crisis today. So I may be incorrect. But when I look at that low score on long-term orientation, and I believe it to be fairly reasonable, then that causes me some concern. Okay, now because this has gone on so long, I'm not going to go through all these charts in detail, but just to point them out to you that you can do bar charts to show the relative strength of countries and all of these scores rather than look at something like that. You can look at something like that. Then, yeah, I guess that's it. And for that reason, no, I guess that's good enough. That takes us then to, pardon me. Another way to report the results is in an exhibit like this, where each dimension of Hofstede's model is compared, the countries are compared to each other in an exhibit like this. This is very nice. Sometimes these kind of analyses are either necessary or helpful. It's pretty obvious that power distance is very high in Russia, and the three other red bars, and it's very low in the United States and the other two blue bars in this exhibit. Here we are with uncertainty avoidance. For what it's worth, Germany's score on uncertainty avoidance is also quite high. And so the Germans, among other things, are very prudent, very conscientious corporate planners. They like to use planning to minimize risk. Masculinity, as you can see, is low in Russia for the reason that I explained. Long-term orientation, you can see that red bar, and as I said, that bothers me a bit. And then we see that China, as well as Russia and Germany, take a longer view. I think the United States needs to take a longer view when it deals with strategic issues, and we're at a moment now where strategic issues are intense. And I hope that that short-term orientation will not affect us adversely or give our rivals, such as China and Russia, an opportunity, a competitive advantage. Okay, I think this is the final one, and it's country risk approach or risk analysis. And this might have been put all the way at the beginning because it's most useful in deciding whether to move into another country. But country risk analysis also can be taken, can be done to assess whether a change in strategy is likely to be successful. There are a variety of techniques for assessing a country's economic and business risk. And I encourage you to go to Moodle and search for them. What I'm going to show you is far from the preferred approach. It is, frankly, I've got some exhibits here that were prepared by student teams based upon economic analysis of the countries that they were in. And that certainly is one way to do a country risk analysis. But there are other ways of looking at the political structure of a country, the country's economy, some of those things we've already looked at, such as culture, the willingness of financial institutions to support countries with foreign ownership. When we do an analysis of India, we don't get very high scores because India is very protective of its home businesses, and it's an extremely unwise policy. If it had been more accommodative like Russia was, India already would have grown to a much higher level than it is at today, simply because it has not taken advantage of the technology and methodology of businesses outside India to the extent that it could have. So this is the technique the company that this one team used. And it simply took a look at the economic variables that influence business in various countries: GDP growth, inflation, the budget balance, which affects the ability of banks to support businesses, the current account balance, which influences countries' willingness to permit fluid imports and exports, and the public debt as a percent of GDP. You can read these strengths and weaknesses. I'm not going to go over them, frankly, I'm going to race through what we have left here now by just showing you that you can do comparisons. You can see that when this analysis was done from 2012 to 2017, China's economic growth was just on a tear. And its inflation rates were low. Everything was just a go. No surprise what happened. Oh, okay. Now, so I misled you. There is another another model, and that's the Ansoff growth strategy model. And you should be using this model. Once you've got all this evidence rationalized, the real question is, what will the strategy be? What approach will your company take to growth? And a famous Russian guy named Igor Ansoff gave us a little matrix that enables us to sort of summarize the approach to growth that a company will take. And this certainly applies whether the country is international or not. So here are and you can see this was done for the Schindler Elevator Company by that same team. There are two variables, that is the products, whether they're existing products or new products, perhaps products that aren't in existence now, and whether the company seeks to do business in established markets or new ones. So if the company decides to grow by taking established products into established markets and growing that way, this is called a market penetration strategy. Right? And frankly, this is the strategy that people come to work to do every day. When we go to work at our company, we want to grow that business, and we want to do it by getting a higher market share. Okay, now, if we want to stay in our current market, but add new products, that's called a product development strategy. And in this case, Schindler moved from producing only elevators to escalators and moving walkways. If your strategy is to, pardon me, sorry, I have to do this maintenance work on the fly. There we go. If your strategy is to take your existing products into new markets, then this is a market development strategy. And in this case, Schindler was located, oh my, I can't remember where they were located. I want to say Germany, but I think I'm wrong. In any event, Schindler decided that it wanted to open a subsidiary in India. And so the case that the team in my class studied was Schindler's expansion into India and the difficulties, which were many, that Schindler encountered. Now, a very risky strategy you can see that I had to stop for a moment. I didn't know whether to type that term or the term that really it represents, which is diversification. And very often when we think about diversification, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about taking new products into new markets. So when Schindler developed escalators, that was a new product. And moving walkways were new products. And they were very successful in developing moving walkways for airports as well as for commercial buildings. We're almost done, but pardon me for getting another cough drop. Okay. So this was an exhibit that that took a look at Ansoff today, its current business, and this was the original Matrix. The company at the time that the case we looked at, which was several years ago, was drafted. Since then, Schindler has moved into China. The guy who entered India successfully became the CEO of Schindler. So much has changed, but the company is very successful. So today, and this today is probably a year or so ago, the established products for established markets, so-called market participation, but this is a very successful company in many countries. It has moved into new countries with its established products, elevators, escalators, moving walkways in India and China. New products in established markets, there's something that's amazing. The product is still being developed, but it's amazing. And basically, this is an elevator that travels through a building along tracks that go like this. So the elevator will move this way, then this way, this way, this way. And before you get on the elevator, you identify what floor and what office number you're looking for. And with that, this elevator with a computer identifies the appropriate track to take everybody on the elevator to their various locations. I've been on a couple of these that I don't think they're the state of the art, but what happens in some cases is that in the lobby, the elevator lobby, the passengers will be asked to make their selections for elevator number 3, and it's reported that elevator 3 is going to go to floors 6 through 9, and so forth. But what's really amazing in this most exotic version is that the elevator is a moving. It's sort of like a railroad within the building, or a rapid transit, but it doesn't just go in a straight line. It moves through the building to take you closer to where you want to go. New markets are, again, China and India, and this is just for large businesses and large, for large buildings. But this new technology apparently has been brought to China. I'm surprised to see that it's been brought to India, but that certainly is possible. So let me see if we can get out of this Moodle shell. I guess the way I can do it is by just closing the file. I will check, by the way, and see if this PowerPoint file has been posted to your Moodle shell. If not, if it has been, I'll replace it with this one because I've made some modifications to the slides and I want to give you all the help I can. So, but even with the slides before I made the changes, I think you can get plenty from it. Take a look at these models. You know, you can pretty well figure them out just by looking at the PowerPoints. And then try to use them on your case. And when you do, please feel free to draft up one of the matrices and send it to me. And I'll be glad to give you some help in finishing it up or making a few obvious changes or telling you it looks just fine to me, which is often the case because once you take a little while to just think about these matrices, it becomes pretty straightforward how to do them. And in the process, you might just acquire a skill or two in using these analytic models when you go to work for a company. And the fact that you know how to use these models and analyze strategic situations, whether they are international or domestic, could give you an advantage in your career because even in graduate schools, students don't get a lot of training in these kind of techniques. So if you benefit from this little review, and if you then practice these models in your case, you know, it's like learning how to ride a bicycle. Once you learn how to ride a bike, it's kind of hard to forget. So you'll be able to go to a company someday and use these models. And when you do, you may be able to provide a real service to your company's management and be recognized for that. Wouldn't that be nice? You might make more money. Okay, I'm going to end this. I'm going to try to end this recording here real soon, real quick, and let you get back to doing what you're doing. I know that you've gone through a lot, many of you, to move out of dormitories, to get back home, to reestablish your schedule, maybe to change your schedules at work if you have a job at home. If you're a foreign student, this is even more of a burden on you because you've got to deal with the coronavirus in your home country and still see if you can get a job, or if not, at least settle in. So I am aware that these are times of significant change, but I think that you and I owe it to each other to make as much of this course as possible so that when you complete it, you're going to be able, after the coronavirus panic ends, to get your career started on a favorable basis. And these models can help you do that. And that's why I hope you will take enough time to work with them. So with that,